Last lecture, we saw many reasons to suspect that human freedom is not logically compatible with divine foreknowledge, omnitemporalism, or even presentism. Unfortunately, the threats to human free will go much deeper. Embedded in our conception of free will is a picture of how free decision-making works. Now, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the following is a pretty accurate description of how most people envision the process of making a free decision. It's probably one you have thought of as true at some point in your life. At least I know I have. Here's how that picture goes. Through your experience of the everyday world, you are presented with an option. You realize that you could take one action A or some other action B, and you ponder the options. And by ponder, I mean you consider them mentally. And where does this mental consideration take place? Well, commonly believed to be the soul. But what is a soul? Basically, it's a non-material substance that exists above and beyond and is even separable from your physical body. It's where your mentality is housed, where your emotions are felt, where what you see is experienced, where decisions are made. Your brain may make your soul aware of your options by feeding information to it, but it is in your soul that the options are considered and weighed, and where a decision to do one thing and not the other is made. And once that decision is made, the soul reaches out from beyond the physical world and causes your body to take the action that you have decided to take. This is what supposedly happens when you make a decision. And that's why the question of this lecture is answered most affirmatively by most people. Yes, indeed, our souls do make us free. There really are alternate possibilities. The mental process of considering the two options really could turn out either way. But the way it turns out is really up to you, for your control, or for you control what happens in your soul. It is divorced from any direct causal determination from the world. Those who embrace this story are called substance dualists, for they believe that human persons consist of two separable substances, the physical and then the mental. Those who adopt this view even think that the mental substance can and does exist independently of the physical substance following death. Now, the threat to free will comes from the fact that we have very good reason to think that this story is not true, and indeed that souls are just a fiction. Now, that's not to say that minds and mental activity do not exist, and we'll consider the nature of minds later. But if minds do exist, they do not consist of a separable substance, divorced from causal influence, that can reach out from beyond the physical world to cause our actions. To understand why the soul hypothesis, or substance dualism, is so widely rejected in the philosophical community, it's always helpful to begin with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a well-tempered railroad worker in the 1800s. An accident with some explosives drove a tamping iron up through his left cheekbone and out the top of his skull, pulverizing a portion of his forebrain. From that day on, his personality completely changed. And it wasn't just because he was a bit grumpy due to the fact that he had a horrific accident. He became unreliable. He swore constantly and became a sexual deviant. Now, if the soul hypothesis were correct, this shouldn't have happened. His personality would be housed in his soul and could not be affected by physical damage to his body or brain. But clearly, damaging Gage's forebrain had changed his personality. This led to the realization that Gage's personality, and indeed all of our personalities, are not housed in our souls, but in our brains. Although Gage's story is hotly debated, It sparked a wave of discoveries about the brain that led us to the realization that all of our mental faculties are a direct result of our brain activity. Visual operations are not housed in a separable substance, but in the back of our brain, now known as the visual cortex. Emotions are the result of brain activity, primarily in the limbic system. Decisions are made by the prefrontal cortex. Damage to these centers in the brain eliminates one's ability to perform these mental operations. Now, this is problematic for the notion of free will for two reasons. First, it seems to entail that when we're making a decision, there really are no alternate possibilities. And second, the result of the decision-making process is not really up to us. To see why, let's look a little bit closer at what the brain is. The brain is, at its base, a collection of neurons sending electrical signals to one another along pathways called axons. Neurochemicals, including serotonin and dopamine, help conduct these electrical signals. The way these neurons are wired together and fire signals to one another determines the kind of signals that they send to our nervous system, which determines how we behave. So a key question in determining why we act as we do is determining why our brain's neurons are wired and fire as they do. Well, as a biological organ, much of the brain structure is determined by genetics. This is why everyone's vision, emotional, and decision centers are basically in the same place in their brain. But even the configuration of neurons, how they are wired and fire signals to each other, can be determined by genetics. And of course, the structure of your DNA is in no way up to you. You have the genes that you have, and that's it. So any action that is a result of the genetic structure in your brain cannot be said to be free. It was not up to you. Of course, genetics does not play the only role in determining how your brain is configured. In fact, biologically, our brains are able to reconfigure themselves based on our experience with our environment. When you see something, for example, that affects the structure of your brain. Your neurons fire and will even rewire as a result. In fact, this is what happens when you learn something. You have an experience with your environment, say this lecture, and it will rewire your brain such that you now know something new. Still, the way your environment rewires your brain is determined by how your brain is already wired at that moment. For example, if your brain is not wired such that you can understand English, your experience of a lecture given in English will not rewire your brain in a significant way. Whereas if you do speak English, it will. But ultimately, it's all just physics. Your experience with your environment sends signals to your brain that cause a physical reaction, the outcome of which is determined by the laws of physics. Now, whereas you may not have control of that physical process, you may think that you have some control over how your brain is wired because you have control of your environment. You can control what environment to put yourself in, thus controlling ultimately how your brain is configured. But any choice you make about what environment to place yourself in will be a result of your brain structure during that moment. And your brain structure in that moment is a result of your DNA and previous environmental influences. And of course, your choice to place yourself in those previous environments was a result of your brain structure as well. And once we retrace this process all the way back to your birth, or whenever your brain started to function, we realize that none of your actions were ever up to you. They were all simply the result of a brain structure that was ultimately beyond your control. So, consider my son, Johnny. His brain had an initial structure based on his biology. His DNA, combination of mine and his mother's, determined that his brain was wired in a certain way and would rewire itself when exposed to certain stimuli in a certain way. My wife and I then exposed him to certain environments, many of which were intended to spawn positive rewiring of his brain. This rewired his brain further, but he, of course, had no choice in the matter. He now makes minor choices about what environment to place himself in. He's very cute as he pulls you along. He loves to crawl to the top of the stairs, throw balls down through the gate, and watch them bounce down to the bottom. But he likes to do this only because his biology, or one of the environments we exposed him to, made him like that. It wasn't up to him. As he continues to grow, he will make bigger choices about what kind of environment stimuli he will receive, but those choices too will be based on his brain structure. Ultimately, all of Johnny's actions are a result of his brain structure, which is ultimately a result of his genetics and environment, both of which are ultimately out of his control. And of course, the same is true for all of us. In no meaningful way do we have free will, because in no meaningful way is our behavior really up to us. But realizing that our behavior is ultimately determined by the functioning of our brain, a biological physical organ, also suggests that we are not free, because it suggests that we cannot behave differently than we do, that there are not alternate possibilities when it comes to how we will act or what we will decide. And as we discussed last lecture, free will seems to require alternate possibilities. But why aren't there alternate possibilities? Well, simply put, the brain is a physical system, and the behavior of physical systems is dictated or determined by physical laws. Think of a billiard table. Once the cue ball is hit, there is no other possible path or resting place for any of the balls. In fact, if you were fast enough with the math, you could simply use the laws of physics to figure out what will happen before it happens. Hit the ball, do the math really fast, you can figure out where everything's going to go. Likewise, since every decision you make is just the result of physical processes in your brain, firings of neurons, there's only one possible outcome every decision could have. Given the way your neurons are wired and the input they receive, you couldn't decide any other way. One of my favorite examples that illustrates this comes from the second Matrix movie, The Matrix Reloaded. Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, is presented with a choice by the architect to either A, cooperate with the machines and save all of humanity at the expense of his life, love, Trinity, right? Or B, to risk all of humanity to go and try to save her. Although it seems that Neo has a choice, the architect observes, quote, "But we already know what you're going to do, don't we? Already I can see the chain reaction, the chemical precursors that signal the onset of an emotion designed specifically to overwhelm logic and reason, an emotion that is already blinding you to the simple and obvious truth. She is going to die, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." The architect is able to simply look at Neo's brain and predict what he will do. Given his brain's physical configuration, there is only one possible outcome of his decision process. He's going to go try and save Trinity. He cannot act otherwise. But of course, if he cannot act otherwise, then his action is not free. Now, there is a possible objection to raise here. It turns out not all physical systems have outcomes determined by the laws of physics. One of the major discoveries of the 20th century was quantum mechanics and the realization that some physical events at the quantum level, the realm of things smaller than atoms, some such events are truly random. They are unpredictable and uncaused. It's not that we don't have enough to make a prediction about what will happen. There exists no information on which to base such a prediction. It's not that we haven't discovered their cause. It's that we have shown, we have proven that they don't have a cause. Indeed, they cannot have a cause. So, if the outcome of some series of neural firings was dependent upon how or when a certain quantum event occurred, we really could say that there is more than one possible outcome, that there are alternate possibilities. Problem is, that fact won't actually help us defend the idea that we have free will. First of all, it's not at all clear that the brain is a physical system whose outcome is dependent upon a certain quantum event. Although all physical systems have quantum events in them, the random effects of quantum events are usually averaged out in the larger physical systems, such that even though you don't know exactly how each part will behave, you do know how the whole larger system will behave. The behavior of the system is predictable, even though the behavior of the parts is not. If, for example, you have a collection of carbon-11 atoms, you can't know if or when any one of them will decay, but you can know that half of the entire set will decay in the next 20 minutes. That is carbon-11's half-life. If you have 100, in 20 minutes, you will have only 50. Every collection of carbon-11 atoms behaves in exactly this same way. Or think of a computer. There are actually random quantum events happening inside your computer all the time, but none of them dictate the outcome of its entire process or its processes. When you run a certain program or click a certain icon, you'll always get the same result. And that's because the causal reactions that dictate how a computer behaves happen above the quantum level, at the level of chips and circuits at which quantum effects are averaged out. In fact, how computers work is a good analogy for how the brain works, one that we will return to later. Basically, the causal reactions that dictate how a brain behaves happen at the level of chemicals and cells, where the effects of quantum randomness are not felt. But even if your brain is wired such that the outcome of a single quantum event can dictate the outcome of a neural decision process, thus making alternate outcomes possible, this still won't save free will. Why? I mean, it gives us alternate possibilities, right? It's because you don't determine the outcome of quantum events. No one does. No one could. In fact, no thing could. As I've said before, we've shown that quantum events are truly random. They have no cause. Even in the rare circumstances when we make a quantum state collapse by measuring it with a device in a lab, how it collapses is still not up to us. And a decision that is random and uncaused, that is in no way up to you, cannot be free any more than one that is determined by the laws of physics. To somewhat loosely paraphrase the philosopher Peter Van Inwagen, indeterminism is no more compatible with metaphysical freedom than determinism is. Now, you might be tempted to say, determinism and indeterminism be damned. I think the soul really does reach down from beyond the physical world to cause our behavior. Maybe it causes our brain to fire in certain ways, or even causes the outcome of quantum events in our brain, and that's how we're free. But this suggestion flies in the face of even more fundamental scientific laws. Our soul reaching down and moving physical particles would violate the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and violates the law of conservation of momentum, which states that the total momentum of any system always remains constant. And it violates the causal closure of the physical, which says that physical events that do have causes only have physical causes. Recall the criteria of adequacy. Conflicting with established science makes the soul hypothesis very unconservative. Its scope is also poor because it raises unanswered philosophical problems. How, for example, could a non-physical object like a soul make a physical event like a neural event occur? And in virtue of what can my soul affect physical events only in my brain, but not physical events anywhere else, like in your brain? It can't be because my soul is somehow closer to my brain than it is to yours. Since the soul is non-physical, it has no location. These kinds of problems of interaction or downwards causation have plagued substance dualism since its inception. The soul hypothesis also lacks simplicity, since it introduces an extra entity made out of an extra substance to explain our behavior, when in fact an already known entity made out of an already known substance, our brains made out of physical material, will do for that explanation. Clearly, the soul hypothesis is not an adequate hypothesis. Okay, so now we've seen some serious reasons to doubt that we have free will. Not only do we not have alternate possibilities because omnitemporalism seems to be true, and because the outcome of the physical processes of our brain that dictate our behavior are deterministically predictable, but the notion that we have a soul that somehow reaches out from beyond the material world to give us alternate possibility and make our decisions up to us is both philosophically and scientifically problematic. But I'd like to finish this lecture by discussing some stories and experiments in the neuroscientific literature that also cast serious doubt upon the existence of free will and the conception of a soul in general. Consider the second chapter of one of my favorite books, Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, in which he discusses Witty Ticky Ray, who has Tourette's syndrome. Now, as you may know, Tourette's causes people to shout out obscenities at random. Other symptoms include nervous tics and other uncontrollable speech patterns. Witty Ticky Ray had trouble keeping a job and maintaining his marriage because of his Tourette's. If humans had souls, Ray's soul certainly decided long ago to stop ticking and swearing at random and would have reached down beyond the universe to stop his brain from causing him to tick and swear. And yet his Tourette's persisted. In fact, it was only through the administration of Haldol, which increased his neurons' ability to send signals to one another, that gave Witty Ticky Ray any kind of relief. Or consider the patients in V.S. Ramachandran's book, Phantoms in the Brain, another favorite of mine, who have paralysis denial. A stroke in the right hemisphere of their brain has left them paralyzed on the left side, but has also left them incapable of admitting their paralysis. Ask them to tie their shoe, and they will fumble with their shoelace with their right hand, and then insist that they did tie it with both hands. Ask them to clap, and they will raise one hand to the middle of their body and insist that they can hear themselves clapping. They can actually hear the clapping sound, thus perhaps answering the old staple question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Give them a tray of glasses to lift, and you get a quite curious result. Patients who admit their paralysis will lift the tray from the middle, but patients with the paralysis denial will lift it from one side, thus toppling it and soaking themselves with water. And then they will sit there insisting with a big soggy lap that they lifted the tray successfully. And they aren't putting us on. Dr. Ramachandran isn't stupid. He's done every possible test to ensure their honesty. They really do believe that their left side is not paralyzed, even though it is, and will actually hallucinate themselves clapping and tying their shoes and lifting trays of glasses to accommodate that worldview. Dr. Ramachandran even has a neurological explanation for why they behave this way. Roughly put, their stroke in their right hemisphere has negated that hemisphere's ability for reality checking. Usually it's the left hemisphere's job to hold on to a worldview and the right hemisphere's job to observe discrepancies and suggest revisions to that worldview. But since the stroke put the right hemisphere out of commission, and at that time of the stroke, the left hemisphere believed that the patient's entire body was functional, that belief continues after the stroke, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The right's not there to correct it, basically. Such behavior seems odd to us because of the assumption that people have souls, a separately existing entity that houses their mentality. How can one simply not recognize that their left side is paralyzed, just admit it and behave accordingly? For example, by admitting that they cannot tie their shoes. And indeed, if such mental activities were the purview of a separately existing entity, a non-material entity, Physical damage to one's brain would not be able to prevent that kind of realization. But once we realize that our mentality is the work of our brain, and specifically that the job of reality checking belongs to the right hemisphere, which is damaged in these kinds of strokes, we can understand perfectly why these people behave as they do. And ultimately, we understand why we behave as we do, because of the structure of our brains, not the decisions of our souls. Of course, Sachs and Ramachandran present us only with case studies, but things get even worse when we look at what goes on in the brain during the making of the decision. First of all, our brain functions by sending signals back and forth, and different parts of our brain will vie for control by sending inhibitory signals back and forth along pathways between those parts. For example, if you have an emotional reaction to something that causes you to want to behave a certain way, maybe lash out in anger, but you know rationally that that's not the best way to behave, your emotional limbic system and your rational prefrontal cortex will basically battle it out. Your limbic system will send signals to your cortex suggesting that you lash out, and your cortex will send inhibitory signals to your limbic system to try to dampen its influence. This is why babies and toddlers cry so much more often than adults. The connections reaching down from the frontal cortex to the limbic system in babies are not yet developed, meaning the limbic system basically just has free rein to control their behavior. Now, over time, we can rectify this. The more our cortex practices control of the limbic system, the more connections from the cortex back down to the limbic system grow. So as we get older, sometimes reason does win the day. Unfortunately, according to New York University neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, in his book, The Emotional Brain, even as adults, the inhibitory connections running down from the cortex are never as strong as those running up from the limbic system. So even for us adults, our emotions control most of our actions. We may think that our reasoning is responsible for the decisions we make, but most of them are just driven by our emotions, and we just rationalize our emotional decisions afterwards. But if we look at scientific experiments, not just case studies, but experiments about what goes on in your brain during decision making, things look even worse for free will. In the 1960s, the neuroscientist Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Lueder Dekker discovered that if you measure a brain activity before a decision occurs, you can actually see the processes that lead to the decision being made. And it turns out they happen before the decision is consciously made and have nothing to do with the part of the brain responsible for conscious decisions. They called it a readiness potential. And since then, their findings have been supported and reiterated in many ways. In the 1980s, Benjamin Libet showed that the readiness potential occurred 0.35 seconds before a decision is consciously made. In 2008, neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes performed an experiment in which people decided which button to push while watching a series of letters being displayed. And then they would report what letter was displayed while making their decision. Haynes found that unconscious parts of the brain were busy doing their work to bring about the eventual action seconds before the reported letter appeared, long before the conscious decision was made. Neuroscientist Itzhak Fried did a similar experiment where he observed neurons more directly and was not only able to see the brain unconsciously deciding what to do before the conscious decision, but was even able to predict the conscious decision with 80 to 90% accuracy before it was made. These results are astonishing, even if you are not bothered by determinism or quantum randomness or the fact that our decisions are determined by the structure of our brains. If you believe you are free, you have got to think that your conscious decisions play a causal role in the actions that you make. You've got to think that when your free will is exercised, you are consciously making a decision. Your consciousness is involved in decision making. But what these experiments seem to indicate is that your conscious decision is just an afterthought. The real decision process is done by the unconscious parts of the brain, and once they've done their work, they send a signal to the consciousness-producing parts of the brain, like the frontal cortex, that gives you the conscious experience of making a decision. But the brain activity that produced that experience, or the parts of the brain that produce them, don't play a role in determining what action you'll take. Much like it creates the illusion that objects are a certain color, the brain is literally creating the illusion that we have free will. Now, the fact that decisions about what button to choose are not free doesn't necessarily mean that more grandiose decisions about what to do with your life, for example, are not free. More experiments clearly need to be done. And the results of these experiments that we've just discussed are challenged by some scientists. And that's probably not too surprising, given how ingrained our belief in free will is. In fact, even if we don't have free will, it's not clear that we could actually believe that we don't have free will. Next time you're making a decision, try to believe that you're not free in doing so and see how successful you are. Perhaps, when asked whether you believe that we have free will, the correct response is Isaac Bashevis Singer's, quote, "We must believe in free will. We have no choice," end quote. In other words, we are not free to believe the truth, that we are not free. I'm reminded of Kant's noumenal-phenomenal distinction. Recall that he says there's the noumenal world, the world as it really is, independent of our perceptions, and then there's the phenomenal world, the world as we perceive it. We create the phenomenal world by interpreting the noumenal, by organizing it according to the categories of our perceptions, cause and effect, unity, plurality, etc. And we see the world through category-colored glasses. Well, maybe free will is one of those categories. We aren't really free, but when we look at ourselves, we can't help but see ourselves as free. But the unshakable notion that we are not free has caused some to defend free will in a different way, to suggest that we've been conceiving of free will in the wrong way all along. After all, if free will doesn't require alternate possibilities, the fact that there are none would do nothing to entail that we do not have free will. So, now we wonder, what else might it mean to be free?